Thank you, guys. I hope you're hungry. As you can tell, brought breakfast for you. I've got a number of cheeses, and we're going to explore all the different kinds of cheese, styles of cheese, textures, milks, different milks. We have goat's milk, sheep's milk, cow's milk, which is the big three. Passing around some information packets right here. And I made these very simplistic on purpose. I just wanted to give you some good information on just cheese in general, and didn't want to overwhelm you with a big stack of paperwork. Of course, if there's things about cheese that I maybe touch on that you're interested in, of course, the internet is just a wonderful, wonderful resource. But I wanted to give you something that you could actually take physically with you. And I'm just going to go over this real quickly. We're not going to read through it word by word. But on the first page, there's some categorical cheese terms. Artisan cheese, farmhouse cheese. And then there's a little blurb on what raw milk and pasteurized cheeses actually is. And then the second section here is basic cheese classifications. There's different kinds of classes of cheese or styles of cheese, but they're not succinct unto themselves. There's a lot of, they could be a washed rind, blue vein cheese. There's a lot of cross classification within this. To start at the top, artisan cheese. Artisan is one of those words that's kind of been hijacked. If you go to a Safeway store, in their bakery, everything's artisan. Artisan baguettes. It's coming from frozen dough. It's one of those that a lot of people, it's like gourmet in the past, you know, it used to mean something. Gourmet meant something on a food product, and now it's just kind of a general, you know, you find gourmet frozen foods, that sort of thing. What an artisan cheese means is that it's made by a cheese maker, not by a large factory where it's all automated. That doesn't mean that an artisan cheese, they can't use modern equipment, but it's made by people, more by hand than by machine. Farmhouse cheese, the second listing here. What farmhouse cheese means is that the actual milk is derived from animals that are on the farm. It's made on the same farm. So if you see farmhouse on a cheese, that really does have a very important meaning to it. You can't make a cheese from milk that's from the farm across the road and call it farmhouse cheese. Farmhouse cheese means it is actually made on the farm in which the animals are raised. And then raw milk and pasteurized cheese. Every cheese needs to be heated to a certain extent in order to make the cheese. But pasteurization is an actual process where you need to raise the level of that milk to a certain temperature to kill bacteria, any kind of nasties that might be in that milk that might make you sick. The problem is, what gives cheese its structure and flavor and savory nuances is the same bacteria that you're killing. So pasteurization, there's two different ways to pasteurize. There's slow pasteurization, which you raise the milk to a certain heat level and then hold it for a long time, and that kills all the bacteria. Or there's flash pasteurization, which a lot of the large producers like Kraft and those use. That's where you heat it to a very high temperature and then it's done. Now what that does to the milk, it pasteurizes it, yes, but it also cooks the milk in a sense, and it can change the flavor of the cheese. So when you see raw milk cheese and pasteurized cheese, a lot of people ask, I thought raw milk was illegal. Raw milk cheese is not illegal, but the FDA does state your cheese needs to be aged a minimum of 60 days if it is a raw milk cheese. In their estimation, at that point, any kind of nasty bacteria, anything bad in that cheese would not survive that long. So there are plenty of raw cheeses. Now, a lot of people ask, is raw cheese better than pasteurized cheese? I would say in general, being a cheese person, yes, it probably is better. It has more of the original flavor of the milk and the enzymes and the structure of the milk. Is that to say pasteurized cheese is bad cheese? No, absolutely not. There are some phenomenal pasteurized cheeses as well. It's just some people choose to make raw milk and some choose pasteurized. Why all the large producers use pasteurization is because it's a much safer way. There's less that can go wrong with making that cheese. There's no bacteria to get in there and actually ruin cheese. And trust me, as a cheesemaker, if you make a raw milk cheese and something goes wrong, you know it right away. So it's not like you're going to be passing along bad bacteria. Basic cheese classifications. Fresh cheese. We have a fresh cheese here. It's actually a fresh goat's milk cheese. That's just uncooked, unripened, just basically very fresh tasting style cheese. Soft ripened is your typical Brie and camembert. Soft ripened always has the what they call the white fleur on the outside, and that is a mold. It is a purpose mold that is actually put on the outside to help the cheese ripen and also to flavor the cheese. And the thing I'm always asked every single time when you serve a Brie or a camembert, do I eat the rind? Okay, it is meant to be eaten. It is part of the cheese. But if you don't like it, after all, it is a mold, it's perfectly acceptable to cut it away. But that's the one question everybody always asks. Do I eat the rind on this? Double cream, triple cream, those are generally also soft ripened cheeses. And it, just as it indicates, there is cream added to it. This Brie that I brought you today is classified a double cream Brie, meaning they add a little bit of cream. Then triple cream is about 70% butterfat or higher. Very, very rich, decadent cheeses. Normal camembert and Brie is just whole milk, which is about 45% butterfat. And I'll talk about butterfats a little bit later when we actually tie into the Brie here. Washed rind cheeses. Those are your typical quote-unquote stinky cheeses. What they do is they actually wash the surface of the cheese, usually with a brine solution, just a simple salt water solution. But depending on what that cheese is, it can also be washed with beer. It can be washed with wine. It can be washed with spirits. In the case of Epoisse, a very, very stinky, soft washed rind cheese from France, they wash it with a Marc de Bourgogne, which is basically like a grappa, distillate of grapes. And what that does is a couple of things. It protects the surface of the cheese from bacteria. It also flavors the cheese in various different ways. But it also promotes a certain bacteria. The actual clinical name's that big, but it's B. linens is the acronym for it. And it gives kind of a ruddy orangish rind, and it really smells quite fragrant, shall we say. And I did not bring any of that cheese today, so I have had some cheese that will clear a room sometimes, that you open it up. And as a cheesemonger, you actually learn good stink and bad stink. I used to think no one ate stinky cheese. They just said they did to appear sophisticated. And when I owned the cheese shop, it actually got to be my favorite style of cheese. But it is definitely an acquired taste. So washed rind cheeses are definitely your strong, stinky style cheeses. Natural rind cheeses, basically they're the harder cheeses. They just have a natural rind, like a manchego. Or a Gruyere, just has a natural crust that they usually turn the cheeses and dust them off. Blue veined cheeses, again, is, I think everybody may have had blue cheese in the past. That is also a mold, and often said that it was discovered by accident, blue cheese was, and I'll talk about that when we tie into our blue cheese. And then we got uncooked pressed cheese and cooked pressed cheese. It gets kind of clinical from there on out. On the second page, I just had some quick information on the differences between goat's milk and sheep's milk. Like I said earlier, the big three is cow, goat, and sheep, and we actually have one cheese here that is all three. If you look down at the milk breakdown right here, this little chart, the very last column is lactose percentage. I'm sure you all know or have heard of somebody who say, I can't eat cheese, I have a lactose intolerance problem. But I can eat sheep's milk, that's fine, or I can eat goat's milk cheeses. But if you look, the lactose percentage is almost identical between all three animals. People sometimes do have a cow's milk lactose intolerance. Sometimes they have a cow's milk allergy and mistake that for a lactose intolerance. Lactose is the milk sugars that's inherent inside of milk, and some people just can't process it. But more often than not, sometimes it's just an actual allergy and not really lactose problems. If a person truly has lactose problems, they can eat an aged cheese. If it's aged about 6 to 8 months or longer, there is no lactose left in there. It's all converted to lactic acid, which people can process if they do have a lactose intolerance. And then the milk production right at the very bottom left is kind of interesting. If you look at those numbers, cows give milk 300 days per year, between 1,300 and 2,100 gallons per animal per year. That's a lot of milk. Goats, 240 days per year, between 140 and 230 gallons per animal per year. And then sheep, down at the very bottom, they got the best union of all the milk givers. 150 days per year, between 150 and 140 gallons per animal per year. So when you're at the store and you are looking at the goat's milk cheeses and you are looking at the sheep's milk cheeses, that's why they're usually a little more expensive, because the animals just don't give that much milk. The big trade-off is goats and sheep can be raised virtually anywhere. Cattle need a lot of pasture, a lot of grazing. Of course, with this kind of milk that they're giving the numbers. But goats and sheep are very rugged, and the actual stereotype of goats eating just about everything is actually positively true. They will eat just about anything you put in front of them. And I'll tell you a little story. When I was in France, that's actually pretty humorous when we're talking about the goat's milk cheese. And then the last page is basically just an uber simple one-page description on how cheese is made. Of course, it's a much more complex process than this, but it just kind of gives you an idea. One thing I can tell you is making cheese, if you are a cheese maker, especially on a medium to large scale, it is a lot of work. There's a lot of labor, there's a lot of technical aspect, there's a lot of scientific aspect that goes into making a cheese. It gives you an appreciation once you look into how actually cheese is made, especially really good artisan aged cheese. There's a lot of hard work that goes into it before even the cheese is made, and a lot of trial and error for the cheesemaker. So it's a very simple process, but there's a reason why there are virtually thousands of different styles of cheese made, all the way from what milk you use, what feed you're giving your animal, because that comes through in the milk in a big way. If your animal is eating grass, you get a grassy flavor to that milk. If it's eating grain, it's a more neutral flavor to that milk. How do you heat the milk? How do you harvest the milk? How long do you heat it? Do you cook the curd? Do you not cook the curd? When do you slice it? When do you salt it? A lot of different things, enzymes. I mean, it gets very, very complicated. If you have one person making a cheese in this farmhouse, and across the road another guy's making the cheese, and they're virtually doing the same process, it will taste much, much different between the two. So that's it for just the quick overview. And what we're going to do is I'm going to pass the cheese out and just talk about the cheeses, the individual cheeses, any information about those. And if there's something that I kind of slide on by or something you need a little clarification on, please just throw your hand up and let me know. Please interrupt me, because I can just talk forever and bore you to tears about cheese. And I want to make sure you're getting all the information that you want to get out of this class. So we're going to be tasting cheeses basically from the lightest flavored cheeses to the heaviest. So obviously the blue cheese is going to be very, very last. I don't want to blow out your palate with a very strong blue cheese and then have you taste like a Brie or a fresh chef, because you won't be able to taste it. So like I said, we got a lot of different styles and a lot of different flavors and textures going on. Has anybody never had a goat's milk cheese? Okay, not too many. That's about 5 years ago, it would be about half the class. I think goat's milk cheese has really come into its own in a great way. And we've got a fresh chef here. But I'm actually going to start out with a fontina. Now this comes from a company called Belgioioso in Wisconsin. I've got 2 plates. I'm just going to give one to each row, and then if you could just pass it on back. And I guess it would have been helpful to pass out the plates first. But what's interesting about this is American fontina. Now, what do I mean by American fontina? Well, you know, as a country, America has hijacked a lot of different cheese styles, cheddar being one, a lot of Italian-style cheeses. Of course, our Parmesan for years and years was the stuff that came in the little green can. This is an American fontina. It's very buttery. It's a great melting cheese, and that's what we kind of use this style of cheese for, is not so much what I would call a table cheese, but a cooking cheese. It's something that you incorporate into dishes. You want to melt over the top, pizzas, flatbreads, that sort of thing. And why I'm trying to make this distinction is if you get a true fontina from Italy, it is much different than this American-style fontina. The Fontina Val d'Aosta is the name of the true Italian fontina, which comes from the Aosta Valley. And it is, like I was talking earlier about the wash rind cheeses, it is kind of a little stink bomb. I mean, it's got some heft to it. It's a very complex and interesting cheese. But here in America, the fontina that we get mainly at the grocery stores is this style of cheese. It definitely has its place in the kitchen. We sell a lot of this cheese in food service. It's just, as you could tell, just a really good, friendly, amiable kind of cheese. It's not going to challenge you in any sense, but it just has kind of a good, nice, buttery, friendly flavor. Now I want to follow that up with the fresh chef. Now the word chev, oh, of course. Now the word chev, of course, is a French word, and what it means is goat. So chev is goat. Often asked, well, do you pronounce it chev? Do you pronounce it chèvre? And I say, well, we're Americans. We pronounce it however we want to, usually, when it comes to French pronunciations. But this comes from Sonoma, California. This is from a company called Laura Chanel. Laura Chanel was one of the first goat cheese producers in America that really made a name for herself with this particular item. And one thing you're going to notice is this tastes like goat's milk. I often find some people don't really care for it. It does have just maybe a little bit of that barnyardy pasture flavor. And when I say barnyardy, and a lot of these terms that I may use sound horrible, but it's kind of like wine tasting, you know, where you're tasting a wine, they say, do you taste the cat pee in there and all this weird pencil shavings? And it's kind of the same with cheese. If I say barnyardy, I'm not really trying to degrade the cheese or downplay the cheese, but it definitely has kind of that oomph, kind of that little pasture flavor. But you get more of a sense of how goat's milk actually tastes. The milk between a cow and a sheep and a goat, if you tried the raw milk itself, they do taste quite different. And obviously the cheeses that they make are very, very different as well. Now, that's not to say that this is the only style of cheese that is made with goat's milk. There's soft ripened goat's milk cheeses. There's cheddar style cheeses being made with goat's milk. Especially in our state of Colorado, we have, I think last count, there was at least 18 different little independent goat's milk producers, cheese producers here in Colorado. There's also Alex Seidel, chef of Fruition Restaurant, owns a farm down south, and he makes sheep's milk cheeses. And he makes one of the most incredible sheep's milk ricottas I've ever tried in my life. Again, and I was just speaking about that earlier, ricotta is just basically a recooked cheese. They take the whey, the solid part, of the cheese and recook it. That's what ricotta means, recooked. They use sheep's milk, and it makes a completely different ricotta than a cow's milk. Very nutty. It has a beautiful kind of yellowish fat that just drips off it. I know it sounds disgusting, but it's not. It's really, really good. And so different milks, and as I said, different diets as well, really do influence the flavor of a cheese. But a fresh cheese, a very mild cheese, can be one of the most awesome cheeses you ever had. It doesn't have to be a huge aged flavor bomb. Let me do the Brie first. Now this right here is Brie. And again, this is an American style Brie. This one is made in Wisconsin. This is the size of the Brie that we're serving today. And I've got an extra plate here if we don't have enough towards the back. In France, this is not Brie. This is not the size of Brie in France. They would laugh at us for serving this as Brie. This is the size of camembert. Now, what's the difference? People always ask, what's the difference between Brie and camembert? They're both soft ripened. They're both very, very similar. Well, that's a very hot discussion in France. The Brie area, the Brie de Meaux, Brie Nangy, is southeast of Paris. And then camembert comes from Normandy, which is way up in the north. And they are constantly arguing amongst themselves who invented this style of cheese. But the camemberts always come in a small wheel this size. Brie in France comes in larger wheels. It can be a wheel up to 18 inches across. It can be very, very large. Now this is the atypical soft ripened cheese. This has the fuzzy rind on the outside, as I mentioned earlier, and this is a double cream. I'm sorry?
The rind on the Brie, what is that called?
It's just called the fleur, or the flour. That's the French term for it, because it looks like flour. It's just white fluff. And as you can tell, this one has a very, very thick rind on it. That's what you're going to find in this country. This is kind of more of a mass-produced style Brie. Truly made Brie and camembert, they mix the mold culture into the milk before they set the cheese, and then that white fleur just naturally blossoms as the cheese ages. I was actually in a cheese cave in France, underground cave, where they actually affine or age cheeses, and we went into the Brie room where they're aging these things, and it smelled like someone had kicked over a 50-gallon bucket of ammonia. It was, I mean, we were all looking for the door. We didn't know if we were going to be able to stay in that room. But that's one of the byproducts when cheese, soft ripened cheeses are aging. It really does have an ammonia smell to it. It's not, it doesn't mean that the cheese is bad. It's just a natural byproduct. But ironically, if you get a Brie and it is overripe, you get that ammonia smell to it. A lot of times you'll get a little whiff of that, and it doesn't mean your Brie is bad. It just means that's part of the process when it's actually aging. But real Brie, when they actually mix that culture into the milk, it blossoms, and it doesn't look nice and white and pristine like this one. If you look at the actual rind, it's just this beautiful snowy. It looks like a little white carpet, like a little velvet carpet. True Brie and camembert, since it does blossom naturally, is kind of motley, and there's different colors going on, a little bit of white here, and it really looks horrible, but it tastes wonderful. But this is a sprayed-on mold, because it actually protects the cheese quite well. And yes, sir. Oh, sorry. Cow's milk. And if you notice, there's stickers on the plates. At the bottom, it has what milk it is. It's either cow, goat, or sheep's milk. So, but yeah, and I mean, but like I was saying earlier, they do make goat's milk Brie and camembert, or soft ripened cheese. I should be more particular. The Italians love doing mixed milk cheeses. They call theirs roviolas, and they do a little bit of cow, sheep, goat mixes. Very beautiful soft ripened style cheeses. And as you can tell, this one is fairly mild as far as Brie goes. I've had some raw milk Bries in France that, boy, they just smack you around. They're strong, strong cheeses. And when I'm talking barnyard, yeah, I'm talking like licking the bottom of a barnyard with some of these. That was on the verge of, I don't know if I like this or not kind of thing. This one is called Iberico. This comes from Spain, and this is a mixed milk cheese. This has all three milks included. It comes from the Iberian Peninsula in Spain. Very classic cheese. Looks very much in fit form and style like a more famous cheese called Manchego. Now, Manchego from Spain is a pure sheep's milk. It comes from a breed of sheep called Manchega sheep. That's where it gets its name. This one looks absolutely identical in size and color and form, and I'll show you what it looks like here. It comes in about a 6-pound wheel, and if you notice, this rind has kind of a nice little crosshatch pattern on it. You can see it on the end of your cheese there. Back in the days, what they used to do is weave the molds out of local grasses in Spain, and then they would put the curd in there to age, and it would leave that mark. They don't do it, this is a plastic mold, this is made in a plastic mold nowadays. But what I love about this particular cheese is the three milks. You can taste different stages. It has a different flavor from beginning to middle to finish. It is predominantly sheep's milk, then goat's milk, and then it just has a little splash of cow's milk. Sometimes the goat you can just barely taste. But it's a more complex cheese. This is a younger cheese, as you can tell by the texture. It's a softer cheese, which means it's not as aged. But it does have a very nice, approachable complexity to it. Very fine table cheese. And I use that terminology a lot, table cheese, cooking cheese, that sort of thing. But there are some that are definitely used for both. Now this next one, this is going to be a Vermont cheddar. Now what's the first thing you notice about this cheddar?
Sure.
It's white. Yeah, exactly. Milk does not come out of any animal, orange actually. And that was something that happened way back in the day when color was thought to equal quality. The same reason why they feed chickens a certain feed to make the meat a certain color. They would add annatto seed to the milk to make the cheddar orange, or at least a little bit deeper color, because the thought was, well, only good milk has that nice, rich, deep color. If it's too white, it's not very good milk, which, of course, is not true. There's a Scottish cheddar called the Isle of Mull, which is a cheddar-style cheese, which the cows are actually fed kind of the spent solids after they make Scotch whiskey, so they're probably extremely happy cows there. Gives a very pale milk, but that cheese is just as full and robust and flavorful. So it's really not correct to say that the color of milk is really an indication of the quality. And that's where orange cheddar came from. When I owned the cheese shop, people come and say, "What do you got in orange cheese?" And well, we usually don't sell cheese by color, but I would just try them on different cheeses. And but it's still something, not so much nowadays. I think a lot of people understand that is more of a colored cheese. And there are still some classic cheeses that they still do color. Mimolette from France, if you haven't been really following the cheese world too much, like I do sometimes. Mimolette was banned from America because it had, it looks like a cantaloupe. It's just a round little cheese, and it has a hard rind, natural rind on the outside. And what happens is cheese mites get in there, little tiny mites that like to eat the rind of cheese. And of course, well, gosh, we can't have that in America, so you cannot import mimolette. And it looks exactly like a cantaloupe both outside and inside. Once you cut into it, it's so orange. They traditionally, they've been doing it for hundreds of years, by the way. They add annatto to color to color the cheese. And annatto is a seed that has a very, very rich coloring to it. So it has been used. So it's not just a modern addition to cheese. It's actually been done to a certain extent in some of the historic cheeses as well. Now this cheese right here, this comes from Vermont. Cheddar actually came from England. It is an English cheese. It came from the town of Cheddar. That's where it derives its name. Now, it didn't just derive the name from the town. It is also an actual process called, you guessed it, cheddaring. What that involves is to make cheddar. It's a certain process you go through to get a certain texture and flavor. You actually make your cheese. You mill the curd, break it up into littler pieces, and then repack it and stack it upon itself in the sheets of curd. What that does is it expels the whey, which is the water weight of the cheese. And that is called cheddaring. The actual milling and the stacking is called cheddaring. And what that does is it gives you a certain texture to the cheese. Ironically, nowadays, there is no cheddar being made in cheddar anymore. There are still some extremely fine English-style cheddars, true English cheddars that are cloth-bound, aged. When it's Keen's cheddar, there's also Quick's cheddar, been made for hundreds of years. And they are virtually unlike American cheddars. Again, that's one of those that we kind of hijacked and made into the soft little craft style or Cracker Barrel style cheddars, which is not a bad cheese. But if you try an English cheddar, it is much different than what we would call a cheddar. This one has a good mid-sharpness to it. The English version seems to have almost a musty cellar flavor to it. They wrap it in thick bandages and age it for at least 8 months up to a year. Can have little blue streaks running through it. It's a very, very beautiful cheese, but a lot different than what we call cheddar here in this country. But this one here is from Vermont, from Abbey Farms. It is all-natural cheese, which sounds kind of weird to say, but especially when you're talking about things like Velveeta and all that, which has additives to it to make it that texture. That is not an all-natural cheese. It is also RSBT-free cheese. RSBT is growth hormones that a lot of dairy farmers have used in the past. It's on the decline now, of course, to get their animals bigger, stronger, produce more milk, that sort of thing, but not quite sure. There really hasn't been any proof that it's harmful to humans at this point, but it probably just hasn't shown up yet. Anything that you're adding hormone-wise can probably do something down the road, who knows, but you'll see that in a lot of cheeses now where it says RBST free, meaning that they don't give hormones. There's no hormones, no trace of hormones, and antibiotics and all that wonderfully nasty stuff that you hear about in the news, because it can be passed through very, very easily in the milk. So this was an all-natural cheddar. Jackson.
Jim, in the store we see sharp cheddar and mild cheddar.
Yes.
What differentiates the flavor profile?
It's basically the enzymes that are used within the cheese making and how the cheese is made. Of course, sharpness is describing the bite that you get, the kind of bite that you get. This one, I would say, would be about a mid-sharp, the one that we passed around. Of course, mild cheddar really doesn't have any bite. It's just good, creamy, user-friendly kind of cheese. And then extra sharp, and there's no real designation as to what extra sharp is. There isn't a percentage of sharp. There's really no rating process. So it's just kind of up to the cheesemaker if they want to promote it as an extra sharp or a sharp. And you'll see that on a lot of the processed cheeses.
Why is the cheddar wrapped in cloth?
That's tradition. Again, to protect the cheese. You got to remember, back in the day when they were making this cheese, there was no refrigeration. So it was a way of preserving. And of course, cheese has been described as the controlled rotting of milk, which doesn't that sound delicious? But basically that's what it is you're preserving that milk in one fashion or another. And there's a lot of nasty things, not only bacteria, but animals and different things that could go in the root cellar and eat your winter's supply of cheese. So it was just more tradition. And they do it to this day because it does give that certain nuance and flavor. And you can go to like maybe a Whole Foods or one of those that has a great range of cheeses, and you'll see a cloth-bound cheddar, and it'll say cloth-bound cheddar, and it's invariably probably English, but we're doing some. I know Cabot Farms is also making a cloth-bound cheddar as well, and it does make a completely different cheese. But it's mainly preservation and production. Next up, we have Gruyere. This is a Swiss cheese. And, of course, you're going to know this comes from Switzerland, and you'll know as soon as you try it, this does not taste like the deli Swiss in any form or fashion. This is the classic Swiss cow's milk cheese. That is the major ingredient in Swiss cheese fondue. You can also add Emmentaler and other Swiss-style cheeses to make the fondue. But you'll notice this is pretty far from the deli Swiss that you're probably used to on your sandwiches. This has an intensely nutty flavor. This is what is referred to as an alpine cheese because a lot of Switzerland, of course, is mountainous. So alpine cheeses are where the actual animals have been grazing at high alpine altitudes. What that means is the vegetation is much different up there. Again, what goes into an animal comes out in its milk. And so the vegetation that an animal eats at alpine level is going to be different than a pasture. It's going to be different than if they're in a feedlot. So it really makes for a different flavored milk, usually a richer style milk. This is a cheese that you can also get in different ages. I didn't really speak about aging too much. Goudas, Gruyères, Manchegos that I mentioned earlier, you can get anywhere from 3 months of age to 6 months to 12 months. And in some cases, there are some aged Goudas that are 5-year aged cheeses. And of course, if you compare the two together, if you have a nice fresh Gouda, like the one you get at the grocery store in the red wax, and then a 5-year aged Gouda, it's not even going to resemble the same kind of cheese.
What's the age of this cheese?
The Gruyere is aged about 8 months. There's also another Gruyere called cave-aged Gruyere, and you will see that depicted clearly on the labels. This is what we call a younger Gruyere, but the cave-aged Gruyere actually means something. It's aged longer, and yes, it is actually aged in a cave, in an underground cave in Switzerland. They're called the Kaltbach caves, and they run for about 1 kilometer underground, and it's where all these cheeses are aged. And of course, that kind of harkens back as well to the old days. Like, well, where did they keep all their food without refrigeration? Caves. Caves were one of the best ways. It's extremely, the temperature stays the same. It's humid. The humidity stays the same. So it's just a perfect place to put your foodstuffs. So that, when you hear cave aged, it really does mean something. Now, when I was talking about the caves I was in France, those were not caves. Those were underground bunkers, basically, where cheeses were being aged. But they call them caves in France. But this was like a very modern cave. It was just underground, cement walls, computer monitors on the walls to monitor humidity and temperature and that sort of thing. Because this was at an affineur. This was at a place where he ages cheeses. That's his job. He doesn't make anything. He doesn't make a cheese. He ages cheeses. In France, that is an extremely important and very highly respected job, actually. His name was Philippe Alios, and didn't speak a lick of English, so we took the tour and tried to have the translations. it was a trip, but yeah, I mean, like I said, it smelled horrible, but it was just one of those things that it really opens your eyes as to how cheese is treated. But the Kaltbach caves, getting back to the Kaltbach caves, it's a natural cave that they've kind of expanded on, but that to this day is where all the Kaltbach Gruyere is aged. and they come in a huge wheel. It's about probably 50, 60-pound wheel. So very large. But is this the first time anybody tried actual Gruyere? A couple? Because a lot of people say, oh, Swiss cheese. I love Swiss cheese. Well, what kind of Swiss are you talking about? This next one you should kind of recognize. This is Feta. This is sheep and goat's milk Feta. Again, one of the very, very ancient style of cheeses. This one's going to be very salty. Traditionally, it was just made with whatever milk you had. If you had a sheep, you made your Feta with sheep. If you had a goat, or if you had both, you just mixed it. In this country, in the grocery stores, 99.9% of all the Feta, the mass-produced Feta is just cow's milk. And again, especially when it comes to a fresher style cheese like Feta, the different milks really come into play. This is going to taste much different than a cow's milk Feta. You're going to get a little bit of that goatiness around the edges. The sheep's milk also has a little bit of earthiness to it. Sheep's milk cheeses tend to have a little more nuttiness to them as well. And also the texture. Sheep's milk has a more grainy texture to it because of the composition and makeup of the milk. So Feta cheese, very ancient, and there's different forms of Feta as well. We just signed on with a company called God, which is G-A-D, not G-O-D, out of Israel. And he makes an ultra-filtrated Feta, which is, it's almost like tofu. It is the most amazing Feta I've ever had. It's just very smooth. If you've ever had like soft tofu, that's the texture of this Feta. And that's what he says, that's true Israeli Feta. He says, he told me straight out, you don't have real Feta in this country. You know, stuff at the Athenos at the grocery store, he just thinks is an abomination. But again, this cheese differs in the fact that it is basically kept in a brine solution. When you get a Feta, it's just in a big bucket of salt water. So, of course, preservation, salt preserves it, but much different texture and much different flavor. It tends to be saltier for that fact. But I think the mix of milks makes this a much different Feta. If you've ever done any kind of tastings before, setting different styles of one thing, like if you did a salt tasting, if you did a vinegar tasting, it really illustrates how different. We did a Feta testing, and it really, I mean, we had a big glass of water too. But it was really interesting, the nuances and the differences, which are very remarkable when you try them side by side. This one here is called Old Rotterdam. This is an aged Gouda. This is a cow's milk Gouda. And what you're going to notice is the color, first off. See how deep, kind of yellowish orange this cheese is. This does not have annatto in it. This is not a colored cheese. Part of the Gouda making process, to make a Gouda, you cook the curd. When the whey is expelled out of the curd, you actually cook it. What that does is it caramelizes some of the milk sugar, some of the lactose that's in there, which is actually a sugar. It caramelizes that to a certain extent, and you pair that with age. This one is aged about 10 months, so just under a year. When you caramelize that milk sugar, when you age that cheese, it turns out this color. It's a little bit caramely looking. And if you notice in the flavor, there is a hint of caramel. There's a little butterscotch in there. That is due to the caramelization when they're cooking the curd, along with the aging process. And at this point, too, what you'll notice in this cheese is the occasional little crunchy deposit. And the older a cheese is, you get more of those little crunchy deposits. What that is salt and milk proteins during the aging tend to bind and crystallize. And if you were ever a kid and you grew little crystal things in a jar or whatever, you know, just the longer you let it sit, the crystals just keep going. That's what happens with cheeses. It's in aged Parmesans as well, the whole Parmesans. You get those little crunchy deposits. It is not a flaw in the cheese. Some people think, well, what's wrong with this? They didn't age it correctly. No, that is definitely a part of the cheese. And a lot of aficionados like that because it gives you a little burst of flavor. It gives you a little bit more texture. But it is just something that's inherent in any kind of aged cheese because it's just going to happen, that little crystallization. So it is definitely not a flaw. And you can tell if you've never tried an aged Gouda before, this is not your red wax Gouda. This is a completely different cheese. You notice it has a much more intense flavor. Cheese and wine are very analogous in that way, in that very fresh cheeses like the fresh mozzarella, things like that, the ricotta we were talking about, are very mild. I mean, they're good, lactic, mild, friendly cheeses, but they're not a lot of flavor per se. Wine, when you first make wine, it's just grape juice in the beginning. After the whole aging process and the entire transformation, it is completely different than what you started with. Aged cheeses are the same way. If you're a cheese maker, you don't make a fresh cheese, think, I think I'll just age it for a while, see what happens. You have to set out to make an aged cheese because it takes a lot of TLC, it takes a lot of care to maintain that cheese, especially if you're talking one of those 5-year Goudas, which basically there is absolutely no moisture left in that cheese. It does not really cut apart, but it just shatters apart more than anything else, and it's just amazing cheese. Did you have a question?
Where can you get that? The Rotterdam, can you buy that at like just King Soopers or Safeway?
You can buy, there's a number of cheeses which are in the same vein. The old Rotterdam is actually just food service right now, but look for a cheese called Prima Donna. There's one called Old Amsterdam, which is very popular. Da Vinci, I think, is another one. And you can just ask for an aged Gouda. But there are many different companies who make that because it's an extremely popular cheese.
Delicious.
When I owned the cheese shop, it was an artisan cheese shop called The Truffle in Cherry Creek, which is still there, by the way. And if you really want to tie into some high-end artisan, wonderful cheeses, if you got the money, I would visit them. They'll give you samples of everything. But they do a lot of the imported cheeses that you really don't get at Whole Foods and
Where
such.
is it?
It is at 6th and Fillmore. It's a tiny little boutique shop. Yes?
How high can the cheese get?
Well, when I worked at the Truffle, interesting you say that, for one, this was back in the day when we used to be able to import, even though we weren't supposed to be able to import, raw milk Brie, raw milk camembert. We would get these little farmhouse artisan cheeses from France, from some little podunk farm no one ever heard of, and then never see it again. It was a cool time. You can't get that nowadays. We imported a cheese from Italy called Lining. It sounds almost Asian, but it was called Lining. And it was a mixed milk cheese, hard-aged cheese wrapped in tobacco leaves. And was it a good cheese? It was an interesting cheese. But what I loved about that is you tasted that cheese, and your mouth would kind of go numb from that tobacco leaf. It's kind of freaky, yeah. We had to retail that at $75 a pound.
What?
That's the most expensive cheese that I remember seeing.
Are there like any Asian cheeses?
No, not really.
No.
And I get asked that a lot, so that's a great question. It's just not in their food culture. As a matter of fact, a lot of Asians think cheese is just disgusting. They can't imagine eating it.
They eat chicken feet.
Well, yeah, it's just, chicken feet, yeah. It's like us thinking, oh God, you eating chicken feet? They think, what are you eating, milk from a cow? I had a friend of mine, his wife was actually Korean, I believe. Cottage cheese, she couldn't even look at cottage cheese. It'd make her retch. And she was, oh God, you think, it's cottage cheese. That's because it's in our food culture. They really don't have, and they're starting to acquire a taste for cheese in the modern day. So I'm not telling you that there is no cheese, in Asia, but it's just not something that's inherent to their culture. They had more of the soy and the tofu and that sort of thing is where they got their protein, and that's how they preserved their foods. But just not so much the cheese, because the animals that they had were work animals, not milk animals. Yes, ma'am.
Just a comment to that. I lived in Korea and they like everywhere. You're like, you guys all smell like cheese. Like, all
Yeah.
Americans smell like cheese.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Kimchi is not like a delicate aroma as well. I mean, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's it. It's just they'll eat something like that, but then they think, oh, cheese, God, that's gross. And you think kimchi, yeah, rotten cabbage, that's gross too. So yeah, it's just not in their food culture. So just very simple, very simple. This next one's kind of a fun one here. This looks very green. This is called Sage Derby. It is spelled Sage Derby, but it's pronounced Sage Derby. This is actually an English cheese. And again, what you'll notice about this cheese is it has a beautiful veining quality to it. Basically, what they do with this cheese is they cut up the cheese into smaller chunks. They pack it into a mold, and then they pour a slurry of sage-flavored liquid and let it set. They also make some with porter. You'll see some at the stores that have porter beer in them. There's some with malt whiskey. So they're kind of a fun cheese. This one definitely has a sagey flavor to it. It's kind of like it or don't kind of cheese, but it's very striking on a platter. And this kind of enters into the realm of flavored cheeses. You'll see a lot of weird different flavored cheeses out there, and it seems like they're coming up with something new every day.
My favorite cheese is it's a Merlot gouda, so it's been dipped in the Merlot, and it's just like the most amazing thing ever.
Yeah, there's wine soaked, like the Drunken Goat, which is wine soaked cheese, or there's one Windsor Red, which is an English cheese that looks pink. It almost looks like a piece of Spam, because they actually put claret, which is the English word for Bordeaux wine. So it sounds fancier, but it's basically just a cheese with cheap wine in it. But it's kind of a fun cheese. The English really like this style of cheese around the holidays. It's a big holiday cheese, kind of like Huntsman. If you've ever seen Huntsman, it's a cake-style cheese that has a layer of double Gloucester and then blue Stilton, double Gloucester, blue Stilton. It does look like a layer cake. You got the orange cheese and you got the blue cheese, and they love that around the holidays. So the English they're a little out there when it comes to their cheese history. And you'll also see something out there called white Stilton. Now, Stilton cheese is actually a blue cheese, a very fine and revered blue cheese from England, and that's all it is a blue cheese. But marketing people, being who they are, is white Stilton is actually more or less the same recipe as blue Stilton, but they just do not inoculate it with the blue. And it's one that, for whatever reason, in the past about 10, 15 years, they just like to put weird stuff in it. There's ginger, white Stilton with ginger and apple, and cranberries is big as well around the holidays. But they're kind of playing a little fast and fancy free with the naming of it, because English blue Stilton, especially some from Colston Bassett, is one of the most revered names of blue Stilton, is actually the best in the wintertime. So it's very much a holiday cheese, because you're getting the summer milk blue cheese in the winter because they age it that long. It's one of the most phenomenal blues I've ever had. But there's also a lot of bad Stiltons out there as well. So it's a DO cheese. If you don't know what DO is, that's like the French AOC. It guarantees the integrity of a product, that it's actually coming from where it says it's coming from. What's that?
D-O?
DO. Yeah, there's DO. DO.
Oh, just D-O.
Yeah, DO. The English version, I can't remember. The DO is actually Spanish. AOC is French. Appellation Original Control A. If you say you're getting a Poi lentil, it comes from Poi, France. If you're getting English Stilton, it comes from Nottinghamshire, where Nottingham, basically, Robin Hood and all that. That's where Stilton comes from. So you're not getting a blue Stilton from Schenectady, New York, or something like that. It's just they're controlling the actual ancient products and their heritage. They're protecting their heritage. And they're also trying to do the same thing with Parmesan now, since that's one we hijacked long ago with the green can. Like I said earlier, the Italians are just really offended, and have been for many, many years about that. And they don't want anybody calling anything that's not Parmigiano Reggiano, Parmesan. I think, you know, it's a little too late to put those horses back in the barn, but same thing with sparkling wine and champagne. You know, if it's not from Champagne, it's sparkling wine. This next one is Pecorino Romano. This is from Italy. And pecorino, the Italian word for sheep, is pecora. So this is typically what you think of as a sheep's milk cheese in America, Pecorino Romano. Yeah, that's what I put on my pasta. Same thing with Parmigiano Reggiano. Yeah, that's what I put on my pasta. It is very, very much a table cheese in Italy as well, and makes a phenomenal table cheese. Now, Pecorino Romano means it's a Roman-style pecorino, which is a stronger, saltier style pecorino. There's also a Pecorino Toscano, Tuscan-style pecorino, much milder, not nearly as salty, very savory table cheese. Pecorino does not mean it's a hard cheese inherently. A lot of people think, oh yeah, pecorino, that's a hard cheese from Italy. It just means it's sheep's milk. Pecorino, just sheep's milk. There's pecorinos that are very, very soft, very young pecorinos, almost like the Feta that you tried earlier, and anywhere in between. So pecorino means nothing more than that is made from sheep's milk, in Italian, of course, but it does not mean it necessarily is a hard cheese. But this one, yeah, it makes great pasta. As you can tell, it's very, very salty. Parmigiano Reggiano, they love to serve that with balsamic vinegar, with honey. Get that really nice contrast of flavors. And it is true, you cannot call your cheese Parmigiano Reggiano unless it comes from has the stamp from the consortium on the outside of that cheese. And if you've ever seen a full wheel of the Parmigiano Reggiano, it's about 90 pounds. It's huge. It's enormous. And let me tell you, when you get those, we used to get the whole wheels in at the cheese shop, and it had been sitting out for a little while, gets a little bit of oil on the outside. So that was always the challenge, is trying to carry a very, very slippery 90-pound wheel of cheese so we could put it up to get it cut.
What role does the size of the cheese play in the taste or the flavor?
What role does the size of the cheese play? A lot of times, first off, the size of the cheese is just determined by tradition for the most part. But in things like Parmigiano Reggiano, since they age them so long, you need a larger cheese. And it does affect the flavor. If you had Parmesan that was this big, it would get dry and dusty and wouldn't really develop the flavor. So that really does play a part into it, is the aging. You kind of need a bigger cheese. Tradition as well. If you have very small cheeses, they don't ripen the same way. Once you cut into a cheese, it doesn't ripen any further. Like soft ripened cheeses, if you cut into that cheese, technically it's still going to continue to break down, but it doesn't mature, it doesn't age. There was a huge cheese, an Alpine cheese from France called Salaire, and it's about a 60-pound wheel. What was interesting about that is you cut and this happens with Parmesan too. If you're ever around and they're cracking open a brand new Parmesan, stick around. As soon as you crack that open and you taste the cheese, 10 minutes later it's going to taste completely different from the same wheel, because the oxygen, the air is getting into it. With the Salaire, it was very noticeable. We opened that up and we tasted, and I swear to God, it tastes like scrambled eggs, right? We're thinking, and not in a good way, like we're thinking, oh wow, that cheese sucks. We were thinking, oh, how are we going to sell this one? It's horrible. Then we tried it about 15, 20 minutes later, and it had developed this wonderful complexity to it. It was amazing. Another interesting thing, blue cheeses. I would get blue cheeses in from all over the world, and we'd cut into some. Where's the blue? There's hardly any blue in this. Someone screwed up. Again, we look at it half an hour later, boom, it blossomed. All the blue mold just didn't show, because there was no air, or needed some air. It's very bizarre. So yeah, I mean, it does really differ on how the cheese ages, matures, tastes, and also texture is very, very big as well. So if you have a smaller cheese, you age it less and it gets harder, so it just desiccates. than larger cheese. Yeah? Okay, this last one is a blue cheese. This one comes from Belgioioso. Belgioioso is a company in Wisconsin. They make all Italian-style cheeses, but it's all made with Wisconsin milk. This one I'm going to just kind of have you cut yourself, because if you notice, the name of the cheese is called Crumbly Blue, and it is very crumbly. Blue cheeses are generally the stronger of all the groups of cheeses, given that the blue mold in there. And the blue mold can be a penicillin-based mold, and depending on the cheesemaker and what cheese it actually is. Penicillin Roquefort, Roquefort cheese, very famous French blue. So I get the question from a lot of people, and I still don't know how to answer this one. If I'm allergic to penicillin, can I eat blue cheese? And it's a very valid question, because some doctors tell people if they have a very high sensitivity to penicillin not to eat blue cheese, just to stay away from it. Not all blue cheeses have the penicillin-based mold, but they don't want to risk it. And I say this being somewhat educated, because I used to, when I owned the cheese shop, I would do wine and cheese parties for a pharmaceutical rep, and of course a bunch of doctors, and I would ask every one of them, what do you recommend? And a lot of them just say, I'm playing it safe. I don't know. I have never heard of anybody having a reaction to a blue cheese who is penicillin sensitive. And truth be told, I mean, the level of penicillin in here is extremely minimal. If this is a penicillin mold, no, you're not getting inoculated, and you're not going to, get over whatever cold you might have. And another thing that I'm asked quite a bit, if I have a gluten intolerance, can I eat blue cheese? And you're thinking, what? No, there's no gluten in cheese. How cheese, I remember earlier on I said that blue cheese was thought to be discovered by accident. Back in the days when they only had caves, we're back to the caves again, they would store all their foodstuffs in there. And the breads, cheeses, all that sort of thing. Well, as legend has it, I don't know if it's true or not, but in a cave in Roquefort, France, they stored their breads right next to their cheese, and what happens to bread after a while? It gets moldy. So that mold got into the cheese. And of course, back in the day, boy, you just did not throw any food away. So they started eating the moldy cheese and thought, you know what? This ain't half bad. So basically, the blue cheese mold, especially the Roquefort, can be derived from rye bread. And so the thought process, if you try to overthink it, I think, there might be gluten in that cheese. Is there? I have no clue. No one can really answer that, at least that I'm aware of. Maybe someone did some tests. But that's the reason some people will ask, gosh, I'm gluten sensitive. Can I eat blue cheese? It's not a silly question. There's actually a basis to it. Another phenomenon is with hard cheeses. Some people have a definite reaction to hard cheeses. They get migraine headaches. I asked every single doctor about this, and every single one of them just kind of threw up their hands and said, no idea. It is actually very true. Each one of those doctors did have at least one patient who would get migraines from eating hard cheese. Why? Nobody knows. And I had one doctor explain to me, he says, unless we went through a whole battery of tests, just months of tests, and tried to single it out. Food allergies are one of the most difficult things to really nail down, because you have to test for every single variant. So a lot of times, instead of spending all that money and all that to actually figure it out, if it's a lactose problem, like I talked about earlier, or allergy, or why do I get a headache when I eat hard cheese, for crying out loud? Don't quite know, but there's some phenomena. But yeah, I would probably attribute it more to food allergies than anything else. But blue cheeses, getting back to the subject of blue cheeses, they also run the gamut from very, very mild to medium to strong. There's an Italian cheese called Gorgonzola Dolce, very, very, very young blue cheese. Of course, Gorgonzola, everybody knows Gorgonzola. The Gorgonzola Dolce just barely has any blue in it, but it's very creamy, very rich, has just a little tiny bite to it. And then there's some blue cheeses. There's one's called Valdion from Spain. which I actually had Spaniards say, no, we don't eat that. I mean, they use it in cooking. They mix it with butter, that sort of thing, but they don't eat it straight up because that's one that just smacks you around hard. And you put that in your mouth and think, oh my God, what did I put in my mouth? It's almost purple, very, very deep, deep, deep blue. But there's also a cheese called buttermilk blue that's made by Rothcase, by a company that we also deal with. It's very heavily blued, but it's right in the middle. It's right in the middle. It has a good blue flavor to it, but very rich and creamy as well. So they can also run the gamut from very mild to very strong. Yes, ma'am.
Is that cow milk cheese?
Which one? This one you have?
The crumbly blue?
The crumbly blue is cow's milk. Yes, it is. And again, there can be mixed milk cheeses in blue cheeses as well. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
So, probably has to do classes of hospitality students.
Is what? I'm sorry?
Hospitality.
Hospitality, yes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So why do you think all this information would be important for a student who's going to be an event manager or planning events, such as weddings or, corporate meetings?
Okay.
That this would be knowledgeable?
I think so. I think so. Because if you're doing that sort of thing, you're going to get those kinds of questions, especially about like the health issues and things like that. I think are very important. Maybe not so much from product choosing standpoint, that sort of thing. But another consideration I didn't mention is raw milk cheeses and pregnant women. That's also a huge issue. Many doctors, almost all doctors, tell pregnant women not to eat raw milk cheese, only pasteurized cheese. Some tell them only pasteurized hard cheeses. The reason for that is a real nasty bug called listeria, which can kill people. I'm sure you probably heard of some of the listeria scares in the past. But it's something that has been associated with cheese for many, many years is listeria. And it's something that could actually kill the fetus very rapidly. People with autoimmune deficiencies or elderly could kill them as well. So it's nothing to be really trifled with. But the last, I think, 2 reported case of listeria in America came from pasteurized cheeses. So it's just one of those things that usually listeria is kind of an after-the-fact affectation. It's not inherent in the cheese itself. It's just one of those things that playing on the safe side, trying to be cautious. Things like that, yeah, I think are very helpful for you to know because that's something, if you're in the hospitality industry, that you'll get asked. Other than that, I think it's just the strangest things come into play a lot of times in your career that, you had either classes or this experience that really come back to haunt you a lot of times, and you think, oh God, thank God I did that. I can actually talk intelligently. It's like I went to culinary school before I worked at the cheese shop, and I thought, well, that culinary and then cheese shop, well, none of that's ever going to meet. It did numerous times. Not so much in the actual education, but part of our school was studying in France for a month, and just that experience and being able to talk about what we did in France and the regions of France. I didn't know anything about when I went to France. I didn't know anything but Colby and Jack and cheddar. I was just your typical American. That whatever cheese was, at the grocery store, that was cheese. And I actually did not have an interest so much when my friend at culinary school said, "Do you want to go to the cheese shop? I know this guy owns a cheese shop." And I thought, yeah, so big deal. Yeah, I'll go with you. And we went in a little tiny shop, and I thought, this isn't much of a cheese shop. It was the Artisan boutique shop, and he threw me a piece of cheese to take home, and it turned out to be a cheese called Brie, which is one of those triple cream, very rich, soft ripened cheeses. Oh my God. I ate that, and I thought, oh, this kind of cheese shop. And it was funny because the transformation was complete. Probably about a year after that, they needed some part-time help. And I jumped on and, again, didn't know anything about cheese. And then it really turned out to be one of my passions. So I fell into it, is what happened. And sometimes that's what happens. And then I just really got to love the whole world of cheese. And what I love about it as well, I mean, how many different kinds of cheeses do you think are out there in the world? When I ran the cheese shop, we would get new things in, like, what the hell is this? What's that? I never heard of that. We couldn't even find some of them on the internet back then. It was like, we make stuff up and how to pronounce it in French and all that. And we had this one blue cheese called Bleu de la Croix that we didn't know how to pronounce for years, and we plugged it Bleu de la Quille and La Cuille and all this. I mean, we had no clue, and then finally someone told us how to pronounce it. But the world of cheese is just enormous, especially in France, Italy, Spain, you know, where they have that deep history. We used to get people come into the shop, oh, can you get this? I was in Italy. Can you get this cheese? I had this wonderful cheese. Probably not. It was made in a little town, and they don't care about exporting it to America. As a matter of fact, I spoke how we used to be able to get raw milk, camembert, and Brie. A lot of Italian cheeses and a lot of French cheeses we cannot get in this country because we're so rigid and it costs too much. There's importation tariffs and taxes. They have to fill out this insane paperwork if you're in Europe and you want to export cheese into America, with Homeland Security and the FDA and everything getting their fingers into it. A lot of them just said, no, forget it. We're not going to sell to America. There's too much red tape involved. So a lot of those cheeses you're only going to find in Europe, especially in Italy, in France. That might be just a local guy at this farmhouse. He makes this cheese. He distributes it around to a couple of the restaurants, nowhere else. And that's the cool thing. There's a huge, huge world of cheese out there. And this is just kind of scratching the surface of it all. And some very interesting and some very challenging. Yes, ma'am.
I know, like she was saying, in France they eat cheese for dessert a lot. Is that
Yeah.
what kind of cheese is normally?
Any kind. Any kind of cheese. And yeah, and again, we're getting back to kind of cultural differences. And I don't really say they eat cheese for dessert, they eat it after the meal, if that makes sense. Because, yeah, they like their sweets too, so yeah. But what's beautiful about that is, you know, they have the cheese carts in the upscale French restaurants, and we did that when we were over there. And again, I didn't know anything about cheese. I just kept pointing at things, and qu'est-ce que c'est, which means, what is this? What is this? And the guy's kind of rolling his eyes, and, you know. And I tried so many different cheeses, and it's a beautiful way to end your meal. It really is. It's just, again, they think we're just silly and stupid. What do you mean you're eating cheese before you eat the meal? You know, it's like they just don't understand that. But it's just a cultural thing. But yeah, cheese, the cheese course is an actual course. They have different courses. And yeah, it is after the meal. It actually is wonderful. But they have anywhere from goat's milk cheeses, hard cheeses, the triple cream cheeses, and anywhere in between. Jackson.
When you were talking about blue vein cheeses, you used the word inoculate, which is a great word. Can you expand upon that? And then, can you give a quick mention about Maytag blue cheese?
Maytag, okay. Well, blue cheese, it needs to get the mold in there somehow. Depending on what kind of blue cheese, they actually mix that mold culture into the cheese. In the Spanish, I was talking like Valdeón, Cabrales, those style of cheeses, they mix it in. But more often than not, what they do is they have to pierce the cheese with steel rods, and that's how the blue gets into the cheese. If you go to the cheese store and you see some blue cheese that's sliced, you can see straight lines on a lot of this. That's how that mold actually gets into it. It just speeds up the process. But yeah, big steel tines that they just punch with the cheese, and then they wipe it with the mold and or the penicillin. And it just flourishes in there. And you mentioned Maytag. Maytag blue cheese was one of America's first artisan handmade blue cheeses. And yes, by golly, it was the Maytag family who makes the washing machines. As you can probably guess, they had a lot of money. Probably one of them had more money than sense, and decided, I want to make cheese. But they actually do have an underground cave in Iowa that the cheese is actually made, and it is actually still to this day, even though it's a bit on a larger scale, it's still handcrafted blue cheese. But it was one of the very first American artisan-made, handmade blue cheeses.
Is it dangerous for people to breathe in like the mold and everything while they're inoculating? Do they wear masks?
Actually, when we were at the cheese cubs in France, someone asked that same question. He said, you know what's amazing is people who work in my blue cheese room for 6 months never get sick. Because they're always, just like you said, they're breathing in all this, the penicillin. He says, yeah, they never get sick. Because I imagine they're exposed to much more than you eating a blue cheese are ever going to have. And it's just inherent in the room. You know how molds are, that molds are everywhere. That's why in the fridge, you know, you can have something go moldy because that's kind of its job. Mold is just, you know, it'll go after cheese or milk or anything. But yeah, he said that it's not really harmful at all, but it does keep them from getting sick. Sure.
Say you're the man on the street representing the United Cheese World.
Yes.
So what trends are you seeing with chefs buying cheeses and using cheeses today versus what it was maybe a few years ago?
Well, I think people in general are getting more educated into what they're eating, and I attribute that to food television. Quite honestly, people are getting exposed to more than Colby Jack and that sort of thing. Chefs, I think, also like beyond getting local. They also like local, and as I mentioned earlier, Colorado does have a good number of cheese producers. A lot of them go. Haystack being a very famous one up in Niwot, now Longmont. Muco, Camemberts up in Fort Collins. And I mentioned Alex Seidel, his farm and all that, so a lot of chefs like to buy local. But what I'm seeing out there from what we call white tablecloth restaurants, kind of upper echelon, they like to get the smaller made cheeses. They want cheese. They want the farmstead cheeses. They want the ones that are made by people, not so much large conglomerates, that sort of thing. I think the large scale producers tend to skew towards retail, and then the smaller farms skew towards food service. But there's been, I think, a resurgence a bit in cheese in the last, I want to say about 15, 20 years, where we never really thought of cheese, like we were just discussing, as a course, like it is in France. Now they are. You go to some white tablecloth restaurants, and they actually do have cheese courses. You can pick 3 cheeses. You can do 6 cheeses. So it is a very viable menu item. And we're talking artisan cheeses, not cooking cheeses. Now, on that end as well, incorporating cheeses into cooking is also, I believe, becoming more prevalent. You see blue cheese mac and cheese or blue cheese fonduta, dipping sauces, or to make, to use a certain different cheese, a taleggio from Italy on a hamburger, that sort of thing. So they're trying to mix it up. They want to be fresh and exciting, and a lot of these cheeses that were basically, I think, ignored by Americans now have not been. I think it's been definitely a resurgence just in general to the, as I just mentioned, the entire world of cheese is so huge. A lot of these chefs are getting extremely, extremely creative with it. And that's what they like. They like something out of the norm, out of the box. Yes?
One last question, Jim. So if we have in our refrigerators at home, like a semi-hard cheese, like a Gruyere or an Emmentaler or even a cheddar, and we've got it for a while, it's got to develop mold on the side, okay?
Yeah.
First we can just slice that off,
Yes.
and the cheese is still good.
Yes.
What happens to a blue vein cheese when it gets too old? How do we detect mold on mold? I guess would be the question. How do we know when it's time to let it go?
Well, with blue cheeses especially, they just tend to keep getting bluer. I mean, cheeses like blues and a lot of cheeses, they're still a living thing. There's still a lot of enzyme action. There's a blue called Salemville Blue, Amish Blue, that's very popular at Whole Foods. A lot of stores have it. We used to have to double wrap it. We'd wrap it in plastic, cut and wrap it. We'd have to wrap it twice because at the end of the week you'd pick it up and it's just exuding moisture because there's so much enzymic action going on there. With blue cheeses, that blue is a mold, so naturally it's just going to keep going. Sometimes when you open up a fresh wheel of blue, it looks nice and pristine on the outside, and sometimes you open it up, there's blue all over the thing. That's just natural. How do you tell if it's good or not is just kind of up to you and personal preference. Your nose is the first thing. Again, if you get that ammonia, very strong ammonia, and if it's slimy, yeah, round file it. You know, And if it doesn't smell like it's going to taste good and you don't want to eat it, what's the use? I mean, if you're not going to enjoy it, don't hold your nose, force yourself to eat the cheese. And that goes with any cheese. Like Jackson said, if there's mold on the outside, harder cheeses, it really doesn't make, just cut it off and the inside is fine. Softer cheeses is a little different story. The more water weight that's in that cheese, that mold will shoot right through it and affect your entire cheese. But harder cheeses that don't have a lot of water weight in them, you definitely can just slice that off and still enjoy your cheese. But yeah, your first indication would be your nose visually. If your blue cheese looks more gray than blue, that's not a good thing. And then slime too. Blue cheeses especially can kind of develop a slime, and that's when you know it's time to run to the store and get another piece.
Anyone else?
Anything else? Very good. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.